At 18, bruised and with no hope left, Lydia Rowan answered a stranger's ad in the paper. It promised not just a home, but a chance at love. Some folks called it desperate. But when a blizzard came roaring in, when blood hit the snow and death was at the door, Lydia found out that some promises are worth everything. This is her story, a tale of courage and true love. Stick with me, and please comment what town y'all are watching from. I'd love to see how far Lydia's story travels. The bucket was just too heavy. Her aunt shoved it at her, and gray water sloshed over her worn-out dress, cold as ice. She didn't drop it, though. She never did. That would just give Aunt Margaret another reason. And Lydia had learned the hard way to give that woman as few reasons as possible. Well now, her aunt's voice cut through the hall, sharp as a rusted blade. Are you going to stand there like a useless fool, or scrub these floors? Yes, Aunt Margaret. Lydia's voice was a whisper, beaten down over 6 long years. Speak up. Your dear mother sure never taught you any manners before she up and died. Those cruel words hit harder than a slap ever could. Lydia's knuckles turned white. She wanted to scream, to tell her how wrong she was about her sweet mama. But she just bit her tongue and said nothing. She never did. She just carried that bucket down the hall and got down on her knees. The old, splintered floorboards dug right into her skin. She plunged the brush in the water and started to scrub, just going through the motions. This was her life since the fever took her mother, just scrubbing, serving, and staying invisible. This boarding house in the heart of Philadelphia was a run-down, crooked place. It always smelled of boiled cabbage and old tobacco smoke. Aunt Margaret ran the place with an iron fist, renting rooms to all sorts. She had a tongue on her that was meaner than a cornered rattlesnake. And she worked poor Lydia harder than a rented mule she didn't plan on returning. You missed a spot. Her aunt was standing right over her, arms crossed. Where, Aunt Margaret? A bony finger pointed at a clean spot. Are you blind, girl, or just plain stupid? She snapped. Fix it. Then the kitchen needs doing, and Mr. Brennan's mess in the hall. And after that, every single chamber pot needs emptying. Lydia's stomach just turned. Yes, Aunt Margaret. Lydia answered softly, but the older woman just sniffed. She looked Lydia over like she was a stain on the wallpaper. 18 years old, she sneered, and still completely useless. Your own mother was married at 16, at least she was good for something. Then came the cruelest words of all, delivered with a twisted smile. But I suppose if you couldn't keep her alive, you're not much use to anyone. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Lydia wanted to scream that she was only 12, that it was not her fault. She remembered holding her mama's hand right until the very end. But Aunt Margaret was gone, so Lydia just kept scrubbing. She scrubbed the floors until her own hands were red and raw. In the back alley, she dumped the bucket of filthy water. The cold November wind cut right through her thin dress. Winter was coming, and she knew there would be no coat for her. It would be just like last year, and the year after that, forever. That single thought made her heart feel like it might just crack. At 18 years old, this was her life. This was all it would ever be. There was no rescue coming. Just endless floors and leftover scraps. She was sleeping in a closet and dying a little bit more each day. I cannot do this anymore, she whispered to the rats in the garbage. But what other choice did she have? There was no way out. An answer came 3 days later, folded inside a crumpled newspaper. She found it while cleaning Mr. Petton's messy room. A headline on the back page made her stop dead in her tracks. Matrimonial opportunities out west. Her hands began to shake. She had heard the other servants gossip about those mail-order brides. Desperate women for desperate men, they would giggle nervously. But as Lydia scanned the columns, she did not see desperation. She saw a rancher in Montana, a widower with 3 small children. She saw a cattle rancher in Colorado, 32 years old, looking for a wife with a good heart, a heart wanting to be loved. He offered a good home, not riches, but he promised honesty. Lydia's heart thumped as she read it again, a heart that wishes to be loved. When had anyone last loved her? Not since her mother, 6 long years ago, just years of being a burden. But this man from Colorado, he was not looking for a servant. He was looking for someone to love. The thought made her eyes well up. "What are you doing?" Her Aunt Margaret stood in the doorway, fuming. "Just reading the paper," she stammered. Her aunt snatched it right from her. "Thieving now, are we, Darcy?" When Lydia denied it, the slap came fast and hard. Her head snapped back. She tasted blood from where she bit her own cheek. "Don't you dare talk back to me," her aunt hissed, her breath just awful. "You are lucky I did not toss you out on the street like trash. You think anyone else would take a worthless orphan?" Lydia said nothing. She held her burning cheek. "No, Aunt Margaret," she whispered. "That is right. You are nothing, and you best remember it." She wadded the paper and threw it at Lydia's feet. "Now finish these rooms, or you will sleep down in the cellar with the rats." Lydia just stood there, her cheek on fire. After a moment, she bent down. She picked up the crumpled paper and carefully smoothed it all out. A cattle rancher from Colorado, 32 years old, looking for a wife to love. She folded the little ad and tucked it in her pocket with her mother's handkerchief. That night, in her cold room, with the wind blowing through a broken window, Lydia decided she was going to answer that advertisement. But getting paper and ink was tough. Aunt Margaret kept all those things locked up tight, and Lydia had no key. Then she remembered Mr. Peaton sometimes left his writing case in his room. 2 days later, she slipped inside and borrowed one sheet of paper and a little ink. She felt a pang of guilt. She had never stolen a thing in her life, but she was desperate. That night, by the light of a single candle she had saved, she wrote her letter. It took her 7 tries to get it right. The first one sounded too cold and formal. The second attempt sounded way too desperate. The third one said too much. She did not want his pity. Others were too long or too short. But the 7th one felt right. Her final letter came straight from the heart. It held memories of her folks before all the sorrow. She wrote, "My name is Lydia Rowan and I am 18 years old. I must be honest. I have no family and no money. My parents are both gone. I can only offer you a strong back and a loyal heart. You wrote you were looking for someone who wishes to be loved. Well, sir, I have a heart just like that. I can cook, clean, and I am healthy and strong. I promise to do my very best to make you happy. I know this seems foolish writing to a stranger, but I haven't felt hope in a very long time until now. If you are willing to take a chance on me, please write." She added the boarding house address with a quiet request. "Please mark it household supplies so no one will ask." Her hand was shaken. This was a crazy thing to do. He could be a liar or even worse than Aunt Margaret, but he could also be a good man, and that chance was worth taking. Before the sun was up, Lydia slipped out of the house. She walked to the post office with 3 pennies she had saved. The cold from the worn-out soles of her shoes went unnoticed. The clerk read the address. "Colorado, that's a far piece." Lydia just looked at him and nodded. "Yes, sir." He stamped her letter, wishing her good luck. On the walk back, the sunrise made the dirty streets glow. For the first time in 6 long years, Lydia felt a flutter of real hope. But the waiting that came next was pure agony. Every day she watched for the postman, but he always passed right by. 1 week stretched into 3. Her hope was nearly gone. "He's not going to write," she whispered. Aunt Margaret was right. But on the 23rd day, the postman came, holding a letter. Lydia saw it. Her heart stopped cold. She raced downstairs, nearly tripping on her dress. "Is that for me?" she asked the man. It said, "Household supplies." She lied, "It's mine." She slammed the door and ran to her room. Her shaking hands finally broke the seal. It began, "Dear Miss Rowan, I read your letter. Forgive me for the slow reply. My name is Grant Mercer. I am 32. I own a small cattle ranch in Colorado. The place is modest, but it is all mine. I built it with my brother who passed on. I must be honest, life here is hard. The land is beautiful, but also unforgiving. You have no money. That does not matter. I am looking for a partner. Honesty is enough. I know this is asking for a lot of trust. All I can give you is my solemn promise. I will always treat you with respect. You will be my equal, never my servant. You will have space and time to decide. If you will come, I will send the fare. I will not pressure you into a marriage. You will get to know me and this life first. I'll understand if you cannot make the trip. But if you do come, I will be waiting. Yours, Grant Mercer. P.S. Do you enjoy books? It would be nice to have someone to discuss them with. She cried with relief. He was lonely, just like her. She clutched the letter to her chest, her mind made up. She wrote back a simple yes, telling him she loved books. It was a precious memory she had of her mother. His reply came fast in just 12 days. Inside was a train ticket from Philadelphia to Stillwater. Her heart raced when he called her by her first name, Lydia. The ticket was dated for December 15th. He also sent $20 for her traveling clothes. He suggested she pack a book for the long journey. The dining car, he warned her, could get expensive. He would meet her train on the 19th of December. He'd be the tall, nervous fellow wearing a brown hat. The $20 bill was more money than she had ever held. 3 weeks. That's all she had to prepare for her escape. She told no one, knowing Aunt Margaret would lock her away. So she went on with her chores, secretly getting ready. She used 5 of his dollars to buy a second handbag. She packed her mother's Bible and her one decent dress. She added 2 pairs of stockings, mended many times, and Grant's letters, tied up neatly with a string. Hiding the bag under her bed, she waited. December 14th arrived cold and clear after a sleepless night. At 3 in the morning, she rose and dressed quietly. She looked back at the tiny room that had been her prison. All she felt was a deep and welcome sense of relief. She crept down the stairs of the sleeping boarding house. The cold winter air hit her like a slap in the face. She pulled her thin shawl tighter and did not look back. Her heart pounded, afraid her aunt might be following. But the streets were empty and she reached the station safely. The first train of the morning was getting ready to leave. "Ticket," the conductor said, not even giving her a second look. Lydia handed him that little piece of paper, praying he wouldn't ask why a young lady was all by herself. He just punched it. 4 days to Colorado. You bring food? She had, spending her last dollar on it, some bread and cheese to last the trip. "Platform 3, he grunted. "Leaves in 20 minutes. "Thank you, sir." She climbed on and found a seat by the window, her little bag safe at her feet. The car was nearly empty, just an old couple sleeping in a corner and a man reading a paper. Lydia watched the platform fill up, her heart jumping into her throat. She was just sure she'd see Aunt Margaret's furious face storming through the crowd to drag her back. But the minutes ticked on by, and there was no sign of her. Then, with a great hiss of steam, the train jolted to life. Lydia pressed her face against the cold glass, watching the city of Philadelphia disappear. She was leaving behind the dirty streets and the life where she had lost everything. A place where she was seen as nothing more than a burden, a servant in her own home. As the train sped west toward a future she couldn't see, she felt a tear on her cheek. But for the first time in 6 long years, it was a tear of hope, not sadness. The journey was long and rattled her bones, seeming to stop at every little town along the way. Lydia saw the whole country change from her window, from cities to farms to wide open plains. She'd never seen so much sky. It was a wild and beautiful sight that nearly took her breath away. The other passengers changed too. The businessman got off, and a family with 3 noisy children got on. The old couple left in Pittsburgh, replaced by a young pair who were clearly on their honeymoon. They whispered and giggled, making Lydia blush at how sweet they were with each other. At night, she tried to sleep sitting up, clutching her bag like a lifeline. She dreamed of her mean aunt, and of a tall man in a hat whose face she just could not see. What if this Grant fella took one look at her and was disappointed? What if this was all a terrible mistake? The worries just kept getting bigger with every mile the train traveled. By the 3rd day, her food had run out. She was tired, hungry, and plain terrified. On the 4th morning, a woman across the way leaned over with a kind smile. "First trip out west, dear?" Lydia nodded. "I thought so," the woman said. "You've got that look, scared and excited all at once." "I'm Mrs. Henderson." Lydia took a breath and decided to be honest. "I'm meeting my fiancé." "How lovely. He has a ranch near a place called Stillwater," she added. "A rancher," Mrs. Henderson said, her eyes twinkling. "Is this a mail order arrangement?" The question made Lydia's cheeks burn bright red. "Yes, ma'am," she whispered. But Mrs. Henderson just gave an approving nod. "Nothing to be ashamed of, honey. My own sister found her husband that way." They've been married 20 years. Sometimes you just got to give fate a little nudge. She patted Lydia's hand. What's his name? Grant. Grant Mercer. And could you love him? Lydia paused, thinking of his honest, kind letters. She remembered how he promised her space and respect. She thought of the $20 he sent, trusting a stranger completely. Yes, Lydia said softly. I believe I could. Mrs. Henderson smiled. Well, you're halfway home then. The train rolled into Stillwater at 2:17 in the afternoon on December 19th, 1887. Lydia stood up, her legs shaking as she smoothed her wrinkled dress. Through the window, she saw a simple wooden platform and a sign that read Mahomo Stillwater. The town was tiny, just a couple dozen buildings on a dirt road with giant snow-capped mountains behind them. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. Good luck, dear, Mrs. Henderson said, giving her hand one last squeeze. Lydia stepped off the train. The cold mountain air turned her breath into little clouds. The platform was busy with folks, and standing off to the side, looking just as nervous as he'd promised he'd be, was a tall man in a brown hat. Their eyes met right there across the crowd. Grant Mercer wasn't handsome, not in the usual way. His face was weathered by the sun. The lines around his eyes told a story of hard work and long days. He looked older than 32, but that was just life on the frontier. But his eyes were kind, a little unsure but full of hope. He started toward her, then stopped. Lydia took a deep breath and walked right to him. Miss Rowan? His voice was deep and a bit rough. Mr. Mercer. They just stood there for a moment, two strangers about to start a life. You came, Grant finally said, the relief plain in his voice. I said I would. I know, he said, but I worried you might change your mind. He twisted his hat in his hands, nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rockers. I'm sure glad you're here. So am I, she replied. Grant seemed to remember his manners. You must be tired. I got you a room at the hotel. I figured you'd want to rest up before we... He trailed off, his ears turning red. Before we get married, Lydia finished for him, unless you need more time. I don't need more time, Mr. Mercer. I made my choice when I got on that train. A look of surprise crossed his face. Tomorrow sounds fine, she said. That will give me a night to rest and be certain. She thought about her empty pockets and the fact she had nowhere else to go. But more than that, she remembered his kind letters and his promises. Tomorrow it is, Grant nodded, relief washing over his face as he reached for her bag. Lydia saw how he made sure their fingers did not touch. He was giving her space. Come on then, he said quietly. Let us get you settled in. As they walked off the platform toward the small town of Stillwater, Lydia felt that little flutter of hope again. She had taken a leap of faith. The hotel was a modest two-story building with peeling paint. A faded sign read, Stillwater Inn. Grant held the door open for her. A woman behind the desk looked up, her eyes full of curiosity. Well now, is this the young lady? The woman asked Grant warmly. Yes, ma'am, Miss Lydia Rowan. This is Mrs. Callahan, the owner. Pleased to meet you, dear. Mrs. Callahan's gaze softened as she saw Lydia's tired face. You look like you could use a hot bath and a real meal. The room's all ready, Grant. Top of the stairs, second door on your right. I will bring up some hot water and a food tray in a bit, honey. Grant carried her bag up the stairs, and Lydia followed him. This would have seemed scandalous back in Philadelphia, but things were different here. He opened the door to a small, clean room with a bed and a washstand. After years in a tiny closet, this simple room felt like a palace. I will pay Mrs. Callahan for tonight, Grant said, placing her bag on the bed. I will stop by around 10 tomorrow. The Reverend can perform the ceremony at 11. Lydia turned to face this man, soon to be her husband. He stood awkwardly by the door, holding his hat, unsure of what else to say. Mr. Mercer, she said softly, thank you for giving me this chance. A vulnerable look crossed his face. I should be the one thanking you. You are the one who took the real risk, coming all this way for a stranger. Why did you place the advertisement? She asked before she could stop herself. There are 3 unmarried women in Stillwater, Grant replied with a slight smile. Sally Martin is 17. Widow Perkins is 62. She had sworn off men after 3 husbands. Miss Henrietta Grove will not marry a cattle rancher. Lydia, I am just not good with folks. My brother Daniel, he was the charming one. The advertisement just seemed much easier for me. Lydia understood that feeling more than he knew. I meant every single word, he said with sincerity. I promise to be a good husband to you. You will have time to decide if you can be happy. Where would I go? She asked him quietly. You will not be trapped here. I promise you. And for some reason, she truly believed him. He turned back at the door. I am so glad you are here. Then he was gone. Lydia's legs felt weak. Mrs. Callahan brought her hot water and a tray of stew. Lydia ate and then scrubbed away 4 days of train grime. She washed her hair, using her grandmother's special comb. The clean bedsheets smelled just like fresh lavender. Outside, she could hear Stillwater settling down for the night. Tomorrow, she was going to marry Grant Mercer. Her entire life was about to change forever. She was both terrified and excited all at once. The wedding took place in a small white church. Lydia wore her mother's plain and severe black dress. It was unflattering, but it was all that she had. Grant was already there at the front, waiting. His best suit looked stiff and very uncomfortable. He had a small shaving nick and looked terrified. Pastor Williams was a very cheerful and determined man. In that quiet church, Mrs. Callahan and her husband were their witnesses, smiling from a nearby pew. Pastor Williams's voice filled the empty space. We are gathered here today, he began. Lydia hardly heard a word. She was too busy trying to keep her hands from trembling. Grant stood next to her, still and stiff as a statue, making her feel even more nervous. It all felt like a dream, that in just a few moments, she would be his wife. The pastor asked Grant, Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Grant's voice was steady and clear when he answered, I do. Then the pastor turned to Lydia. And do you, Lydia Rowan, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? This was it, her last chance to run. But what other life was there for her? I do, Lydia whispered. The pastor then asked them for the rings. Grant brought out 2 simple gold bands. His hand shook just a bit as he slid one onto her finger. It was a little loose, so she curled her fingers to keep it on. She then placed the other on his hand. His hand felt warm and strong. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the pastor declared. You may kiss your bride. For a long moment, Grant didn't move at all. Lydia held her breath. He then leaned down and gave her a gentle, brief kiss on her forehead. That simple touch felt more meaningful than any real kiss might have. Congratulations, Miss Callahan hurried over and gave Lydia a warm hug. Mr. Callahan gave Grant a firm handshake. Pastor Williams beamed at them. And just like that, it was over. She was now Lydia Mercer. Grant's wagon was waiting. He helped her onto the seat, keeping a polite distance between them. Her little travel bag in the back looked awfully small and lonely. Mrs. Callahan had given them a food basket, which Grant took with a quiet thank you. As they rode away, Lydia looked back at Stillwater, the last little bit of town she'd see for a while. It's about an hour to the ranch, Grant finally said, his voice low. The road gets a bit rough, so you best hold on tight. All right, she answered softly. They rode in silence, the big country spreading out all around them, vast and beautiful. Far-off mountains reached up to touch the big blue sky. The air was cold and clean. It was nothing like the smoggy city she had left behind. Are you warm enough? Grant asked. Yes, she lied, not wanting to be a bother. He must have known she was fibbing. He reached back and draped a thick wool blanket over her lap without saying a word. Thank you. After another long silence, Grant cleared his throat. I ought to tell you about the ranch, so you are not too disappointed. It is not much. 200 acres like I wrote, but only 50 are good for cattle. The rest is just rock. The house is 4 small rooms. My brother and I built it, so it is solid, but nothing fancy. I am not looking for fancy, Mr. Mercer. Grant, he said gently, we are married now. You should call me Grant. Grant, she repeated, and you should call me Lydia. Lydia, he said the name softly. It is pretty. It was my grandmother's name, the one who owned the comb. She was amazed, he remembered. Yes, what was she like? No one had asked about her family in so long. She was kind, Lydia said. She told me stories about Ireland, where she was born. She came to America all alone at 16 and to work as a maid. She said it was the best thing she ever did. She met my grandfather at that house. He was the gardener. They had 5 children, but only my mother lived to be an adult. That is hard. She said it made her grateful for every day. She died when I was 8. I still remember she smelled like fresh bread and lavender. Lydia touched the comb. This is all I have left. Grant was quiet for a moment. My mother died when I was 10. A horse kicked her, and she never woke up. My father was never the same. He started drinking hard. My brother Daniel and I mostly raised ourselves. I am so sorry. It was long ago, he said, but his voice still held the pain. My father died 5 years ago. Daniel and I took what little money there was and came west to buy this land. We wanted to build something. His hands grew tight on the reins. Then Daniel got sick. We thought it was just a cold, but it went into his lungs. 3 weeks later, he was gone. I buried him on that hill. He always loved that spot. You must miss him. Every day, Grant's voice was rough with feeling. The house is too quiet now. I still turned to tell him something, but there is just empty air. Lydia understood that feeling. After my mother died, I would set 2 places at the table. My aunt would scold me, but I kept doing it. I just could not remember she was gone. They looked at one another, 2 people who had lost everyone and learned to be alone. Maybe that is why we will understand each other, Grant said. We both know what it is like to be lonely. It felt more honest than any words of love. When they reached the top of a hill, the ranch appeared below and Lydia's breath caught in her throat. It was nestled in a valley protected from the wind. The house was small, made of rough logs. A barn and other buildings stood behind it. Cattle were dark shapes on the snowy fields. And beyond all of it, the great mountains rose up, strong and forever. It's so beautiful, she whispered. Grant looked over, surprised. You think so? In Philadelphia, all I ever saw was smoke. This is like the world opened up. His expression softened a bit. My brother Daniel used to say that. He said it made a man feel real small but also large at the same time, like you can finally breathe. Lydia knew that feeling down to her bones. Grant pulled the wagon up to the house and came around to help her down. Her legs were stiff and she stumbled. His strong, warm hands steadied her right away. Welcome home, he said quietly. The word home felt foreign on her tongue. Inside, the house was simple and clean, with a main room for living and cooking. Everything was neat as a pin, as if he had scrubbed the whole place just for her. Let me show you around, Grant said, setting down her worn-out bag. This here is the main room. That door leads to my bedroom, he pointed. And that one over there, Mamishu, is yours. She was stunned. Mine? He looked a little uncomfortable. I promised you your own space. It is not large. Lydia opened the door to a small room with a neatly made bed and a simple dresser. The window looked out toward the mountains. It was plain, but it was all hers. She turned back to Grant, her throat tight with feeling. Thank you. It is not much, he said. It is more than I have ever had, she said honestly. He looked at her for a long moment, then just nodded. I will get more firewood. It gets cold at night. We have got 6 chickens in the hen house. I can take care of them, Lydia offered right away. I am used to working. You are not a servant here, Lydia. You are my wife. Wives work too, she pointed out. Besides, I will go mad with nothing to do. A small, real smile finally crossed his face. It changed his weathered features. Fair enough. I will teach you the routine. But for today, just settle in and rest. It has been a long journey. What about you? I've got cattle to check on and a fence that needs mending. He put his coat back on. I will be back by sunset. There is food in the larder, so help yourself. Then he was gone, the door closing softly, leaving Lydia alone in her new home. She stood in the middle of the room listening to the deep silence. This was not the heavy quiet of the city. This was a peaceful, breathing silence. Lydia unpacked her few belongings, placing her mother's Bible on the table. She hung her only other dress in the bureau, a task of 5 minutes. Exploring the house, she saw that Grant kept everything neat as a pin. In the kitchen, she found flour, sugar, and enough for a simple supper. The larder was cool and stocked with plenty of good root vegetables. She felt she could make a real home here and soon had bread dough rising. With the stew started, she swept the floors, her old habits taking over. Soon she heard Grant's heavy footsteps walking up the porch steps. She quickly wiped her hands on an apron she found hanging nearby. He stepped inside, bringing the cold air with him, and stopped dead. He stared at the bubbling stew and fresh bread. "You did not have to do all this." "I wanted to," she said. "I would go mad with nothing to do." He stood there a moment, so she suggested, "Would you like to wash up before supper?" He returned a few minutes later, his face scrubbed and his hair still damp. They sat at the table, and after one bite of stew, his eyebrows shot up. "This is good. This is really good," he said, surprised. "It is just stew." "Maybe so, but it is the best I have had in 3 years. I am a terrible cook." They ate in a comfortable quiet. "You cleaned up some?" he finally asked. "I hope you do not mind." "Mind?" he said. "Thank you." After supper, Grant insisted on washing the dishes while she put things away. They moved around each other carefully, both aware of the small space. "I usually read for a spell before bed," Grant said once the kitchen was clean. "You are welcome to join me by the fire, or you can get some rest." Lydia was not tired, just nervous on this strange wedding night. "I would like to read." He built up the fire and brought over a few books for her to choose from. There was even a Bible, but she picked up a well-worn copy of a novel. He sat on the floor with his own book, the fire crackling between them. It was, Lydia thought, the most peaceful evening she had spent in 6 long years. When the clock on the mantel chimed 9, Grant stood and stretched his back. "Morning comes early around here," he said softly. "You can wake whenever you want." "I'd like to help out. When do you get started?" Grant looked unsure. "Dawn, but Lydia, you don't have to." "I want to, please." He gave a slow nod. "Dawn, then." They stood there, married strangers. "Sleep well," he finally said. She slipped into her room. Her heart was pounding. She could hear him right through the wall. Her own husband, sleeping just a few feet away from her. He had not touched her, keeping his promise of respect. He'd given her space and time. She climbed into the warm bed. The room was cozy, and the heavy quilts made her feel safe. She was married. She had a home. She was finally safe. For the first time in 6 years, Lydia slept without a single fear. Their days quickly fell into a simple, comfortable rhythm. He did his chores before sunrise, and she would make them breakfast. But the small house was easy to keep, and she grew restless. She had cleaned everything twice and needed more work to do. "I reckon I could help you outside," she suggested one morning. "It is cold, hard work," he warned. "I am not afraid." "Please," she begged. He smiled. "You are a stubborn woman." "Is that a bad thing?" "No, ma'am," he nodded. "Dress warm." He said he would teach her to feed the chickens and mend fences. Lydia grinned. The work was cold and hard, but she truly loved it. She loved the sharp bite of the cold morning air on her cheeks. Grant was a patient teacher, showing her how to gather the eggs. He taught her to hold the wire taut while he hammered it tight. They worked side by side in a quiet comfort, and she watched him. She admired his steady hands and his gentle words to the cattle. He always made sure she was warm enough, offering his own gloves. He was a genuinely kind man. One afternoon, a wagon arrived. A friendly woman with bright red hair, about her own age, was driving. "Howdy," the woman called out. "You must be Grant's new wife." "Howdy, I'm Sarah Mitchell, your neighbor." "Lydia Mercer, it is a pleasure." A very pregnant Sarah hopped down. "I brought y'all a welcome cake." She then saw Lydia's patched dress. "Honey, is this all you have?" Lydia admitted she had very little. "Well, that just will not do. I have plenty of dresses for you." "Let's go inside for some tea." Lydia warmed to her kindness instantly. They talked like they were old friends. "Grant is a really good man. He is quiet, but so good-hearted. He helped us and took no pay. He has been lonely since his brother died. Marrying a stranger is hard, is it not? My Tom and I were strangers too. At first I was just so scared, but we grew to love each other. It just takes a lot of patience." "I truly want that," Lydia confessed. "Just give the man some time. Sometimes love can grow slow." Grant came home to a new sight. Lydia was wearing a fine blue dress. He just stopped in the doorway, staring. "Sarah Mitchell lent it to me." You look nice, real nice, he said. Lydia felt a warmth spread in her chest. She told him all about Sarah's visit and the other ranchers. The Mitchells are good folks, Grant said. Tom works hard. But that's Sarah, he trailed off. She sure can talk. Lydia laughed. And she's sweet, though. She invited us over for dinner. Grant shifted on his feet. You can go. I ain't much for socializing. She invited both of us, Grant. I know, but I'll just say something dumb and make you look bad. Lydia put her fork down and looked him square in the eye. Grant, you are one of the smartest men I know. You run this whole ranch. You built this house. You know this land better than anyone. How could you ever embarrass me? I just don't have the knack for small talk, he mumbled. I'm better with cattle than I am with people. Well, I'm better with books, Lydia replied with a smile. I reckon between the two of us, we'll do just fine. He stared at her, his expression changing. You really want me to go? You're my husband, she said softly. Of course I do. He looked down, but she saw a small smile on his face. All right then, he said. We'll go together. That night they read by the fire like they always did. Grant sat on the floor, Lydia in her armchair, but this time he kept looking up at her. When their eyes met, he didn't look away. What is it? She asked. Nothing, he said. Just, that dress looks real nice on you. Lydia felt a blush creep up her neck. Thank you. I was worried you might get lonely out here, with only me for company. I'm not lonely, she said honestly. Not at all. His whole face softened. Me neither. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Something new and quiet was building between them. Then Grant cleared his throat and went back to his book, and so did she. But Lydia couldn't focus. Her heart was beating just a little bit faster, so aware of him sitting right there. About 2 weeks into their marriage, a bitter cold snap settled over the valley. Ice coated everything. Grant was up before the sun, breaking ice in the water troughs so the cattle could drink. Lydia helped, her own fingers turning to ice inside the gloves he'd given her. Walking back to the house, Grant stopped dead and swore. What's wrong? He pointed up. The snow on the barn roof. It's too heavy. It'll cause damage if I don't get it off. I can help, she offered. No, his voice was firm as stone. It's too dangerous and icy. I'll do it. She saw the look on his face and knew not to argue. Just be careful, she pleaded. She went inside and watched from the kitchen window as he climbed onto the barn roof with a big shovel. He was clearing the last section when she heard it. A sharp, terrible crack. And then Grant's yell. She ran outside to see him sliding down the icy roof, desperately trying to get a handhold. He caught himself right on the edge as his shovel clattered to the frozen ground. Grant, she screamed. Barn, her heart leaping into her throat. I'm all right, he called, his voice tight. Just slipped on this ice. Please, come down, she pleaded. I'm nearly finished, he insisted. Grant Mercer, if you break your neck, I swear. Lydia's own fear cut her off. Something in his face softened. He carefully made his way back down the ladder. When he reached the ground, Lydia rushed to him, grabbing his arms tight. You scared me, she said, her voice trembling. He looked down at her hands on his coat. Lydia, you're shaking. Because you almost fell, she answered. What if you had gotten hurt? The words spilled out. I cannot lose someone else, Grant. I just can't. Understanding dawned in his eyes. He gently covered her hands with his own. I'm fine, not a scratch. I promise I will be more careful, he said softly. They stood in the cold, a new feeling passing between them as he held her hands. His thumb brushed against her skin. You care, he said, a look of wonder on his face. Of course I care, she said. No, he replied. You really care. About me. Lydia paused, realizing it was true. This was about Grant, the man. He was no longer the stranger who saved her from Aunt Margaret. He was someone she respected, someone whose absence would leave a real void. Yes, she whispered finally. I care. His hands tightened on hers. For a second, she thought he was going to kiss her. A real kiss this time. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips, but then he gently pulled away. We should get inside. You are freezing, he said. Lydia nodded, a little disappointed. They walked back to the house, the unspoken moment hanging in the air between them. That evening, Grant did not sit on the floor. He sat on the other end of the armchair. He was not touching her, but she could feel the warmth from his body. When Lydia started to doze off, Grant took the book from her hands. "Go on to bed," he said gently. As she stood up, he stood with her. "Good night," she murmured. She turned to leave, but Grant caught her hand, his expression serious. "Thank you," he said, "for caring. For everything." Lydia squeezed his hand back. "Thank you for giving me a place to stay." "This is not just a place," he corrected her. "This is your home now, Lydia. You belong here just as much as I do." His words settled in her heart, warm and true. She belonged. It was more than she ever dreamed of. Lydia lay awake while the wind outside picked up from a whisper. It rattled the shutters and moaned through the roof. She pulled her quilts tight, but something just felt wrong. The air felt heavy, and it made the hair on her arms stand up. She must have dozed off because Grant's boots in the main room woke her. Lydia slipped on her shawl and found Grant already pulling on his heavy coat. "What is wrong?" she asked. He looked surprised. "Sorry, did I wake you?" "A bad storm's coming in fast. I need to secure the barn and the cattle." Just then a huge gust of wind slammed into the house, making it shudder. Lydia's eyes went wide. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough. I've seen these storms bury fences overnight. I have to go now." "I am coming with you," she declared. "No," Grant said, his voice firm. "If it is that bad, you might need my help," she pleaded. "That is exactly why you are staying here," he said, putting his hands on her shoulders. "Please, Lydia, I cannot worry about you and the herd at the same time." She saw the real fear in his eyes was for her, so she finally nodded. "All right, I will keep the fire hot and stay inside. Please be careful." He squeezed her shoulders, then disappeared out the door into the blackness. She watched his lantern bob toward the barn until the swirling snow swallowed it whole. The storm hit with a fury. The wind howled and threw snow against the glass. Lydia thought for sure the windows would break. The whole house groaned. She kept feeding wood into the stove. An hour passed and then another. She paced the floor, trying to hear anything over the screaming wind. Where was he? Surely it should not take this long. He knew these storms, she told herself. But her mind painted awful pictures of Grant lost out in the whiteout. What if he was hurt, just feet from the house, and could not make it back? A tremendous crash from the barn's direction made her jump. She ran to the window but could see nothing but a solid wall of snow. The clock showed it was 3:30 in the morning. He had been gone 3 hours. Something was terribly wrong. She could feel it deep down in her bones. A terrible feeling gripped her heart. Something was terribly wrong with Grant. In that moment, she knew she loved him. There was no time to think. She had to act. She layered on every warm piece of clothing she had. She grabbed the lantern and stepped into the fight. The wind hit like a solid wall of ice. It felt like the storm wanted to push her back. This was pure foolishness. She could die. But Grant was out there. She had to try by him. She walked into a blinding world of white. The snow was deep and each step was a battle. The awful cold cut right down to the bone. Her little lantern was almost useless out here. She screamed his name into the roaring wind. The storm was the only thing that answered. She kept pushing, her lungs burning with cold. She was completely lost. Then she fell hard. Her foot had caught on something in the snow. The lantern went out, leaving her in darkness. Her hands frantically searched the ground. She touched a coat sleeve. It was Grant. He was lying so still and getting cold. She shook him. A faint groan. He was alive. Thank God. But he was hurt very badly. She found a deep bleeding gash on his head. He was far too heavy for her to carry. The house was impossibly far away now. They were both going to die out here. "Grant, wake up," she begged. "You have to help me." His eyes opened. "Lydia? We must get inside." "You should not be here," he slurred. "Too bad." She lifted him onto his feet. He was dead weight. Panic filled her throat. She dragged him through the deep, biting snow. Her muscles burned. He stumbled, unable to help. They stopped for her to breathe. "Keep moving." But she saw nothing. They were truly lost. She moved on pure hope, praying for safety. His legs gave out. They both fell down. "Get up," she begged, tears freezing on her face. "Leave me," he mumbled. "No," she said fiercely. "I will not let you die out here." Her angry voice cut through his daze. His eyes focused. He stood up with her. They staggered on, her arms holding him tight. Everything was numb except for her sheer will. They would not die. Then she saw it. The house. A faint glow in the storm. Almost there. They fell through the doorway together. She kicked the door shut, stopping the wind. She gasped for air, shaking, but could not rest. Grant was bleeding. She dragged him to the stove. His lips were blue. She removed his wet clothes. She buried him in blankets, stoking the fire. His head still bled. She fetched water and cloth. She cleaned the wound. It was not too deep. It needed stitches, like her pa's hand once. With shaking hands, she started to sew the wound. He was quiet. His silence was terrifying her. She bandaged his head. He was bruised but seemed all right. But Lord, he was cold. She laid down beside him, wrapping her arms around him, trying to share her own warmth. "Don't you dare die on me," she whispered close. "You hear me, Grant? You stay with me." She held him tight as the storm howled. After a long while, she felt his skin warm up. His breathing finally became deep and steady. Dawn broke, dim and gray. The storm had settled some, but Lydia was just plain exhausted. Still, she didn't leave his side. Then his eyes fluttered open. He looked lost for a moment. Then his eyes found hers. "Lydia, I'm here. You were hit by something outside. I brought you back. You have a knock on the head, but you'll be fine." He touched his bandage. "You came out in that mess?" "Well, you were out in it. You're welcome." He just stared, a storm of emotions crossing his face. "You saved my life," he said softly. "You gave me a life worth saving." "It seemed only right," she said, her hand finding his. "I've never had anyone." His voice cracked. "Daniel would have called me a fool. My father would have said I deserved it. But you risked everything." "Of course I did." Lydia squeezed his hand. "You are my husband." "Is that the only reason?" he asked, his eyes full of hope. This was the moment. She could hide or she could tell him the truth. "No." His eyes went wide. His free hand came up to cup her cheek. His touch was so tender it made her heart ache. "Lydia," he breathed, "I know this isn't how these things are meant to work. But you're not a stranger anymore. You've become everything." Tears pricked at her eyes. "When I thought you were gone, I couldn't imagine this life without you. Not because I need you, but because I want you." "Is wanting enough, Lydia?" Grant asked. "I think so. I reckon wanting is where love gets its start." He searched her eyes, then leaned in and gently kissed her. This kiss was nothing like the one at their wedding. It felt real and warm. Lydia kissed him right back, grabbing his shirt to hold on to this perfect moment. When they parted for air, Grant rested his forehead on hers. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. "You're wrong," she said, "and I'll spend my life proving it." They lay together wrapped in blankets. While the storm howled outside, a fire burned bright between them. The distance they had kept was finally gone, replaced by something true. Later, she made him eat some soup once he could sit up. She checked his wound and was relieved it looked clean. He fussed about the cattle, but one look from Lydia told him to stay put under the blankets. "The cattle will be fine," she said. "You are not going back out in that storm." A little smile played on his lips. "Yes, ma'am." The storm kept them snowed in for 3 days. In those 3 days, they learned so much about each other. Grant spoke of his dreams for the ranch he built with Daniel. Lydia told him all about her life back in Philadelphia. "Do you ever miss it?" Grant asked her by the fire. "No," she said. "There's nothing but bad memories for me back there." "Still, this must seem like the middle of nowhere," he worried. Lydia looked at the simple room. Then she looked right at Grant. "This doesn't feel like nowhere," she told him softly. "It feels like home." The relief on his face was plain as day. He pulled her in close to his side. On the third night, Grant finally said, "I've been doing some thinking." "About what?" she asked. He hesitated. "About where we sleep." He talked about how she had stayed by his side, making sure his fever didn't rise. "Having you close," he admitted, "it's the best I've slept in a long time." "What are you trying to say, Grant?" she asked. He took a deep breath. "Your room is still yours," he started, "but I'd like you to share my bed. Not for anything," as we used to say, blushing, "just to be close." "Would that be all right with you?" he asked. Lydia thought about her quiet room. But then she thought about the comfort of hearing him breathe beside her these last few nights. His presence made her feel safe. I think I would like that. That night, Lydia moved her few things into his bigger room. It had a mountain view, and he had cleaned it spotless. In bed, they were stiff and careful not to touch at first. But slowly, they naturally drifted closer to one another. Her head found his shoulder, and they just fell asleep. When morning came, the big storm had finally passed. The world was transformed, buried deep under the snow. But they were alive and together. Grant went to check his cattle. Lydia went with him, helping break a path through the snow. They had lost 2 head, but the rest of the herd survived. Standing in the sunshine, Grant looked over the white valley. He turned to her and said, "I should have listened to you. If you had not come after me." His voice trailed off. He took both of her hands. "I have been alone for so long. I forgot what it feels like to have somebody who cares. You saved me, Grant. You gave me a home, and you gave me hope." "So is that our job now? We save each other?" he asked. Lydia smiled. "I think that is what we do." He pulled her in. For the first time in her life, she felt like she belonged, not just to a place, but she belonged to a person. They spent the rest of the day digging out in the bright sun. That night, tired, he gently combed his fingers through her hair. "Tell me about your mother," he asked her in a soft voice. So she told him, and then Grant told her about his own family. They talked about all of the people they had loved and lost. Sharing their grief made it a burden they could carry together. "I sure wish they could have met you," Grant said with emotion. "My brother Daniel would have really liked your stubborn streak. Your mother sounds like she was a wonderful woman." "She was." Grant held her tight. "You risked everything for me." "No thanks needed. Just promise me you will be safe." "I promise," he vowed. "No more foolish chances. I am staying right here with you." She met his gaze. "Grant, I do believe I'm fallen in love with you." He stilled. He gently cupped her face. "You think so, darling?" "No, I know so." His wide smile was like a Texas sunrise. "Good. I fell for you the minute you got here." "You were so brave." "I was a wreck," she laughed. He stopped her words with a deep, knowing kiss. "You are beautiful," he said, "and you are all mine." "And you are mine," she whispered. They truly came together. This was not some cold, mail-order bargain. This was 2 souls finally finding each other. It was real love. Her happy tears started to fall. "What is wrong?" and he worried. "Nothing. It's all so right." She laughed softly. "Last month I was just a housemaid. I felt so unwanted. Now I am just happy." He wiped her tears. "I was a lonely man in this place. You made this big old house a real home. My life is full." He kissed her. "All thanks to you. You are my future." They fell asleep in an embrace. Lydia woke in the night, feeling warm and secure. She was held by a good man who truly loved her. The desperate girl from the advertisement was gone. She was a wife, a partner, and someone who mattered. She was loved. The next few weeks were pure joy. As spring thawed the land, their love grew stronger. They were truly a married couple now. At the Mitchells, she saw Grant relax, telling stories and making Tom laugh. Sarah told Lydia, "You make that man so happy." "He makes me happy too," Lydia said softly. She watched the men working together in the barn. "That's how y'all know it's real," Sarah said. On the ride home, Grant admitted, "That was not so bad." "They are our friends now," Lydia gently corrected. He smiled and took her hand. "Our friends." Lydia worked hard making the old ranch a home. She planted herbs and sewed some new curtains. She took real pride in making the place their own. One morning, a dizzy spell nearly felled her. Grant caught her. "Darling, what is wrong?" As she sat down, a sudden realization struck her. Her hand went right to her belly. She was late. "Should I fetch the doctor?" Grant asked, worried. "No," she whispered. "I think I might be—" His eyes widened. "Pregnant?" She could only nod. A slow, warm smile grew on his face. "You reckon so?" he asked, full of wonder. She placed his hand on her stomach. "A baby." Tears filled his eyes. "Our baby," he whispered. Then just like that, the smile was gone. He snatched his hand back, his face ghostly white. My mother, he choked out. She died giving birth to me. Lydia's own heart felt like it had stopped. I was born and she died, he said, shaking. My father blamed me for all of it. He said I killed her, my own mother. What if I lose you too? He asked, terrified. Lydia stood and took his face in her hands. Grant, look at me. Your mother's death was a terrible thing, but it was not your fault. We cannot live our lives scared of what might come tomorrow. Worrying about all the what-ifs will not help one bit. Her voice was steady, hiding her own concern. We just have to deal with what is happening right now, Grant. I know, he said, his voice thick with pain. You are pregnant with my child, and I could lose you. That raw fear in his voice nearly shattered her. Lydia pulled him into a tight embrace. She felt his whole body shake with deep, silent tears on her shoulder. I cannot lose you, he whispered. Not when I have finally found you. You are not going to lose me, she promised, her tone firm and sure. You don't know that. And he was right. Out on the frontier, every birth was a risk. But Lydia had not fought for this life just to let fear take over now. She pulled back, meeting his gaze. No, I do not know for sure, she admitted. But I refuse to spend all these months living in fear of a ghost. This baby, our baby, is a gift, Grant. A true blessing. And I intend to fight with everything I have to bring our child into this world safely. And if something goes wrong, we will deal with it together, like we always do. She gently wiped the tears from his face. I need you to be strong for me. I need you to believe in us. He looked at her, and she could see the war inside him, his love fighting his terror. The joy of their child was battling the ghost of his mother. Finally, he held her close again. I will try, he whispered, holding her tight. God help me. I will try. But Lydia, if it comes down to a choice, do not, she interrupted him softly. Do not make that choice now. We have months before we have to think on such things. But she knew he was thinking it. She could feel his hands trembling as they held her. The days that followed were strained. Grant was supportive, making sure Lydia rested. But there was a new shadow in his eyes, a distance that broke Lydia's heart. He was absolutely terrified, and he was already preparing himself to lose her. One quiet evening by the fire, she finally had to speak. Talk to me, she said. He looked up from his book. I am talking to you. No, you are being polite. You have been treating me like I am made of glass, like I am already gone. Grant flinched at her words. That is not true. Is it not? You barely touch me. You just watch me like you are trying to memorize my face. I wake up and you're just watching me, making sure I'm still breathing. Her voice cracked. You're already grieving for me, Grant. He set his book down, his hands shaking. I'm just getting ready for the worst, for losing you. Because if I let myself hope, and then things go wrong. He shot up and walked to the window, turning his back to her. I love my mother, though I never met her. I love Daniel completely. His passing nearly broke me. But losing you, Lydia, that would finish the job for good. So you build walls between us? To soften the blow? I don't know what else to do, he burst out. How can I be happy about this baby when I'm terrified it's going to take you from me? I can't be the husband you need when I look at you and see my mother, and my father yelling for help that never came in time. Lydia put down her sewing and held him from behind. He stiffened, then melted into her hug. I'm scared too, she admitted. I'd be a fool not to be, but I am so happy, Grant. Scared and happy because we're having a baby. A child that's half of you and half of me. A child with your eyes, maybe. They'll grow up right here, loved by both of us. If you survive. When I survive, she corrected him. I'm strong, Grant. I survived my mother's passing. I survived Aunt Margaret, that long train ride, and I survived that storm. To save your life, I am not letting this beat me. He turned, hope and fear fighting in his eyes. You promise? I promise I will fight. I'll do everything I can to come through this. That's all I can promise. He pulled her in close. It has to be enough, he whispered. It had to be. In the weeks after, Grant tried, but Lydia could still see the fear in him. He threw all his worry into getting ready, building a cradle with a frantic energy. He built a new room for a nursery, and stockpiled more supplies than they'd ever need. "Grant, the baby isn't due till November," Lydia said as he hauled in more firewood. "That's a whole 7 months from now." "I know, I just want everything to be perfect." She knew what he meant. He was controlling the few things he could. She tried to be patient, but it was exhausting being treated like she was made of glass. The morning sickness ended, and besides being a bit tired, she felt healthy as a horse. One afternoon, Sarah Mitchell came to visit, her own belly round and ready. She saw Grant hovering, while Lydia hung laundry and just shook her head. "Grant Mercer," she said, "go find something to do besides watching your wife like she might break." "I'm just helping." "No, you're smothering her." "Now go on, Grant. This is a woman talk." He nodded his head and left for the barn. "Men," Sarah sighed, taking a seat. "They fret when a baby's coming." "He thinks I am going to die," Lydia said. "His mother did." Sarah's face softened. "Poor thing. And you are scared too. He has enough fear for us both." "Well, now I have had 3 babies. It is hard work, not a death sentence. This life does not have guarantees. Fear of dying keeps you from really living." And that is what I keep on telling him. Let him build things to feel useful. Just do not let him wrap you in cotton. Sarah's frank talk made Lydia feel much better. You need someone who knows their business. A good midwife, Mary Two Feathers, 15 miles off, but she is the best. I am certain she would come and help. Here, I will just draw you a map. Lydia told Grant about her that evening. "I know her," he said, surprising Lydia. "They are good people. I will ride out." "Grant, that is a 15-mile ride, girl. For you, I would ride 100. He got back late with some good news. Mary Two Feathers has agreed to come. She also said you really need to walk. So less resting. Lydia hid a little smile. By summer, Lydia was finally starting to show. Then one day she felt the baby's first little kick. "Grant!" she called. He ran right over, terrified. She simply put his hand on her belly and waited. The baby moved again, and his eyes filled with wonder. "Our baby," he whispered, kneeling down before her. He rested his head against her, full of emotion. "I want this baby," he said softly, "but I want you more." In the months that followed, his fear slowly turned to joy. He was still worried, but a new hope was in his eyes. He began to love feeling the baby kick every day. He spent his evenings carving small wooden toys by the fire. He would talk to the little one growing inside her. He promised a life full of kindness and being strong. "And stubborn," Lydia would always add with a smile. Grant would laugh and kiss her. "I love both of y'all." In September, they visited Sarah Mitchell's new baby boy. Lydia held the tiny thing, feeling a mix of wonder and fear. "He is just so small," she whispered, looking at the infant. Seeing Sarah and her son so healthy was a relief for Grant. It gave him hope that everything was going to be all right. But as October got closer, his old anxiety came roaring back. He barely slept a wink, pacing the floor all night long. He even rode to Mary Two Feathers' cabin 2 times. "Darling, you're going to wear yourself out," Lydia told him. He just fretted. "What if the baby comes too soon?" "Sit down and breathe," she said, taking his nervous hand. "Now I need you to listen to me very carefully, Grant. When my time comes, I'll need you to be strong for us. You are the strongest man I know. You can handle this. You survived far worse. But what if not this time?" Lydia gently held his face. "Then you will survive it. You are a survivor. You will raise our child. And you will tell them their mama loved them, something fierce." Tears streamed down his face. "Do not leave me alone." "Then believe that I will not. Just believe." He pulled her close, bracing for whatever was to come. Then on a cold morning in early November, the time came. Weeks too soon, Lydia woke before the sun to a powerful tightening in her belly. She waited. 15 minutes later, it came again. Labor had started. Grant woke to see her breathing through it, and his face went white. "It's time," she said. "You need to ride for Mary, now." "I cannot leave you," he said as she gripped his hand. "Go, or she will be too late. I will be fine for a spell." He was torn, but he finally nodded. "I will ride like the wind." He struggled for words. "Just wait for me." Lydia gave a small, pained smile. "No promises." He kissed her hard. Then he was gone. She heard the horse's hooves fade. Alone now, she began to prepare. She remembered what Sarah had told her. Boil water, gather clean linens. At first, the pains were far apart. By midday, they were much closer, and so much stronger. She gripped the table, breathing through the waves of pain. Where was Grant? Where was Mary? As if in answer, she heard horses. Grant burst through the door with a small native woman with kind eyes right behind him. "This is Mary," Grant panted, out of breath. "Mary, this is my wife, Lydia." "I can see that," Mary said calmly, moving straight to Lydia's side. She placed a weathered hand on her belly. 5 minutes apart? Less. A strong, impatient baby. She looked at the anxious Grant. "You did well to get me. Now, bring water. And all the clean linens you have." Grant scrambled to do as he was told. Mary guided Lydia to the bedroom. "Is this your first baby?" she asked. "Yes." "Then you must be patient. Your husband is a frightened man." "His own mother died birthing him." Mary nodded. "Then we will show him. We will show him that not all stories have to end the same way." The hours that followed were the longest and hardest of Lydia's life, as the pain became all she knew. Mary stayed right by her side, helping her with sips of water through the waves of pain. Grant refused to leave, so Mary put him to work. "Then make yourself useful," she said. "You hold her hand." So Grant sat by Lydia, letting her squeeze his hand until his fingers went numb. He whispered words of love and encouragement, though his own face was pale with worry. As night fell, the pain came harder and faster, giving Lydia no time to rest. She was soaked in sweat and completely worn out. "I can't do this. Grant," she cried out, "I just can't." "Yes, you can," he told her in his voice strong. "You're the strongest woman I know." Mary nodded. "The baby's almost here. When I tell you to push, you give it everything you've got." That last hour felt like a lifetime, but Lydia found strength in Grant's loving eyes. "Push now," Mary commanded. Lydia pushed and screamed with all her might. She pushed again and again, feeling like she had nothing left to give. Then suddenly it was over. A small, sharp cry filled the quiet room. "It's a girl," Mary announced. Lydia collapsed onto the pillows, crying with pure relief and joy. "You have a daughter." Grant just stared at the baby, looking like he'd seen a true miracle. Mary cleaned the little one and laid her on Lydia's chest. Lydia looked down at her perfect little girl and whispered, "Hello, little one." Grant leaned over them, tears of happiness rolling down his cheeks. "She's perfect," he said. 10 fingers and 10 toes, Mary said with a smile. "A healthy baby girl." She looked at Grant with a softer expression. "Your mother would be so proud of you," she told him quietly. "This is a new beginning for your family. The fear is gone." When it was time to leave, Grant tried to pay her, but Mary just waved his money away. "You helped my grandson. This is just me repaying a kindness." She smiled at the new family. "Y'all cherish this good life you have." After she left, Lydia and Grant were finally alone with their new daughter. Grant thought for a moment. "We'll call her Grace," he said softly, "because she is a gift. Grace Rose Mercer, after your mother." Tears filled Lydia's eyes. "That's just perfect." The three of them lay there together as the first winter snow began to fall outside. Outside, the first snow of the season began to drift down. But inside their little home, everything was warm and full of love. "You did it," Grant whispered, his big hand gently touching Grace's tiny head. "You kept your promise to survive." "We all survived," Lydia corrected him softly. Grant kissed her, then the baby, his own tears falling on them. "I was so scared of losing you, I almost forgot to be thankful for having you. I won't make that mistake again." "Good," she smiled, "because we're fixin' to be together for a long, long time." As little Grace made sleepy sounds, Grant and Lydia just looked at each other. It was a pure wonder. Just 6 months ago, they were complete strangers. She was a girl running from trouble, and he was a man bone-deep lonely. They'd come together out of need, not love. But that need had grown into something strong and true. They had saved each other from all kinds of ghosts, loneliness, fear, you name it. And now they had a future that was sleeping peacefully right there on Lydia's chest. Tell me about your mother, Grant said quietly. I want Grace to know about the woman she was named for. So Lydia told him stories about Rowan late into the night. She told him about her kindness, her laugh, and her strength. Grant listened, saving up every word. He knew he would tell those same stories to Grace when she was old enough to understand. Outside, the snow laid a quiet white blanket over the valley. Inside, a family was finally whole. And for the first time in their very first night together, they were truly home. Those first weeks with Grace were a sleepy blur of feedings and learning the meaning of each little cry. Lydia was tired down to her bones, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that comes from pouring your heart into something precious. And Grant, well, he was a new man. The fellow who was once so scared was now completely devoted. He was devoted to both his wife and his new daughter. He changed diapers without a word of complaint. He'd walk the floors with a fussy grace, singing to her in his deep voice that always seemed to calm her right down. You're a natural at this, Lydia told him one evening as she watched him rock their baby to sleep. I'm terrified every single second, Grant admitted, but I love her so much it feels like my heart could bust. Is that normal? I reckon, she said with a soft smile. That's exactly what being a parent is. When December rolled in, they had themselves a nice rhythm. Lydia would nurse Grace while Grant did the ranch chores. Then he'd take the baby, giving Lydia a chance to rest, or just sit by the fire with two free hands again. One bitter cold afternoon, a knock came at the door. Grant opened it and found Sarah Mitchell standing there. She had her own baby bundled up warm against her chest in a basket in her hand. I know it's freezing, but I had to come meet this miracle baby, Sarah said, stomping the snow from her boots. Tom told me all about it. Said you rode like a wild man to get Mary Two Feathers. He said he ain't never seen a man push a horse that hard in his life. I'd have ridden straight through hellfire to keep Lydia safe, Grant said simply, taking Sarah's coat. And Sarah's eyes softened. Folks in town called you a fool for that advertisement. They said only a swindler would answer, if anyone did at all. Grant looked at Lydia. Well, they were dead wrong about that. You held up your end too, Sarah smiled. A perfect match. Sarah talked all about her life with 4 children, the good in it and the bad. She called Grace perfect and gave Lydia some motherly advice. As she left, Sarah warned, remember, you are a wife first. It is easy to forget your husband when the baby comes. Lydia knew Sarah was right. All her focus had been on Grace. They were both just too bone-tired at the end of each day. Their connection had faded. That night, after Grace was asleep, Lydia found Grant staring into the fire. What is on your mind? Just thinking how a year ago I was all alone in this house. I feared that advertisement was a terrible mistake. Nobody would answer. Then you came. I was not alone, but I was still lonely. We were polite strangers. Now I cannot imagine my life without you. You and Grace are my world. He took her hand. Sarah was right. We have lost touch because of the baby. I miss talking with you, Lydia. I miss it too, she said. Tell me something I do not know. Grant paused. When I was about 8 or 9 years old, I would climb a hill and just dream of all the places I would go. I dreamed of the ocean, big cities, and grand adventures. Instead, I am here. Lydia asked softly, do you regret it? Not one bit. I learned that adventure is not about where you go. It is about who you are with. You and Grace are my greatest adventure. She gently kissed him. I love you. He replied, I love you too. They sat in quiet comfort, listening to Grace sleeping peacefully. The wind howled outside, but they were safe. Lydia, thank you. Thank you for answering my ad, for taking a chance, and for our Grace. And thank you for keeping your promise, she said. You gave me everything. It was so much more. It was a true, deep love, the kind I had given up on finding. Grant pulled her close, and they held each other until little Grace woke them with her cries. As winter set in, life on the ranch settled into a familiar, comforting rhythm. Grace grew bigger by the day, her curious eyes following her parents everywhere. The first time she smiled, Grant just about broke down. He was so filled with woe. Lydia just laughed at him, but knew in her heart that trouble can find you when you least expect it. And it did. One February morning, Lydia found Grace burning up with a terrible fever. A cold panic seized her. "Grant," she called out, her voice shaken. "Something's wrong with Grace." He was by her side in a heartbeat, his own face turning pale as he felt the baby's forehead. "She was fine just a few hours ago," Lydia whispered, her voice breaking. "What if it's serious?" "Don't you go there," Grant said firmly, though his eyes were filled with fear. "We will handle this." He was already pulling on his coat. "I'm riding for the doctor in Stillwater. That's a whole 6 miles. There's a bad storm rolling in, but it don't matter. Our daughter needs a doctor now." "Keep her cool," he said, and with a quick kiss, he was gone into the wind. For hours, Lydia did everything she could, sponging Grace with cool water and trying to soothe her. She prayed harder than she ever had in her life as the storm howled outside the cabin. She worried about Grant out in that blizzard and feared she could lose them both that night. But she had to stay strong, had to keep her little girl fighting until help could arrive. 4 long hours later, Grant burst through the door, followed by a man with a medical bag. It was Dr. Patterson. "Let me have a look at the little one," he said, going straight to Grace. Lydia held her breath, watching anxiously as he gently examined the baby. Finally, the doctor straightened up. "It's the croup. It's common for babies in the winter. Her fever is high, but she will be all right," he assured them. Lydia almost fainted with relief. "Just keep her sitting upright to help her breathing," he instructed them gently, "and make sure she gets plenty of fluids. I reckon she's gonna pull through just fine." The relief was so strong, Lydia's knees gave out, but Grant was there to catch her. As the doctor was getting ready to leave, he turned to Grant. "You did a good thing, son. Most fellas would have waited till morning. You riding through that storm made all the difference." After he left, Lydia and Grant took turns holding Grace, just like the doctor had told them. By evening, her fever had started to break. She was raspy, but they knew she was going to be okay. "She's going to be fine," Lydia whispered. Grant agreed, his face worn thin with fear. "She's a fighter, just like her mother." They stayed with Grace all night long. By morning, her fever had finally broken, and she was nursing again. In just 3 days, she was smiling and cooing like nothing ever happened. But that scare had changed them both. They held Grace a little tighter now. They understood just how precious and fragile a little life could be. Seeing Grace so helpless, Grant admitted, that was the worst kind of fear. A baby can't fight for herself. "That's why she has us," Lydia said softly, "and we'll always be here to fight for her." "Forever," Grant agreed. When spring finally came, melting the snow, Grace was thriving. Her happy laugh filled their little house with pure joy. She was fascinated by every little thing, from the chickens to her own hands. Grant built a small swing on the porch where Lydia would push her for hours. She told Grace stories about her grandmother Rowan and her own mother. "Your grandmother was so brave," Lydia would tell her little girl. "She crossed an ocean all alone, and my mother raised me with pure love. You come from a long line of strong women, Grace. Don't you ever forget it." One afternoon, Tom and Sarah Mitchell came by with their 4 children. The adults sat on the porch while the youngsters played in the yard. "Well, I've got news," Sarah announced. "We're expecting number 5. "Sarah, that's just wonderful," Lydia said. "But how in the world do you do it?" Sarah just laughed. "I swore we were done, but God had other plans." "I'm plumb tuckered out with just one baby," Lydia admitted. "You just get used to being tired," Sarah said with a smile. "The older ones help out." "Y'all thinking about more?" Tom teased Grant, who looked over at Lydia. They hadn't spoken about it, but the question was there in his eyes. "Maybe someday," Lydia said, "when Grace is a little bit older." "Well, you survived the first one," Sarah said kindly. "That's always the scariest part. The rest are just more of the same." After they left, with Grace sleeping soundly, Grant asked, "Would you want more?" "What about children?" Grant asked softly. "Someday would you want more?" "I'd sure love to fill this house up with kids," Grant said. "Give Grace a whole family, but only if you're willing." Lydia thought of the difficult birth, but then she remembered the pure joy of holding little Grace for the very first time. That powerful love had only grown. "Yes, I want that," she finally said. "Not right now, but someday. I want this house filled with laughter and a little chaos." "Well, no," Grant pulled her in close. "Then that is exactly what we will do." We will build that family. That summer was full of hard work as they got the ranch ready for winter. Grant taught Lydia how to manage the ranch, from keeping the books to checking the cattle. She picked it up fast, and he started to trust her judgment just as much as his own. We are partners in this, he told her one evening over the account books, in everything. I do not just want a wife. I want my equal right here beside me. Even though I was clueless about ranching just a few months ago, she asked. You know a heap now, and you see things I miss, he said, pointing to a note she made. A warm feeling of pride bloomed inside Lydia's chest. She had never been valued for her mind before. With her aunt, she had been nothing more than help. But here with Grant, she was respected, trusted, and a true partner. Then in August, a letter arrived all the way from Philadelphia. Her hands shook opening it. She did not have any family or friends left from that time in her life. It was from a lawyer. Her Aunt Margaret had passed on, and Lydia was to inherit everything. Lydia just stared at the letter, feeling a strange and total emptiness. What's wrong, honey? Grant asked her. She quietly handed him the letter. He read it, his eyes full of concern. Are you all right? I do not know, she said. I ought to be happy, but I just feel nothing. That is understandable. She was not family in the way that counts, he said gently. The lawyer needs to know what I want to do with her boarding house and money. Grant put the letter down. That is your decision, and I will support you no matter what. Lydia thought on it for a few days. Then she wrote back to the lawyer. She told him to sell it all, pay off what was owed, and give the rest to an orphanage. She wanted nothing to do with that old life. When she told Grant, he just smiled and nodded. I reckon that's wise. Let the past go. Lydia smiled, feeling lighter. This is home. For Grace's first birthday, they planned a party. All the neighboring families were invited. Are you sure about this? Grant asked worriedly. She needs her community, Lydia replied calmly. The party was a happy, loud, joyful affair. Little Grace, overwhelmed, fell fast asleep. Mary Two Feathers found Lydia for a word. You have built a good and proper life here. I remember two people just clinging to hope, but now I see a real family bound by love. Thank you, Lydia whispered, her eyes wet. The courage was yours. She will grow strong. Later they stood together on the quiet porch. Grant held their sleeping baby in his arms. 1 year ago she was just a hope, he said. And we were only strangers, Lydia added. He looked at her. Do you ever regret it? Lydia looked at this good, kind husband of hers. She gazed at their precious daughter, sleeping. She saw their home glowing in the twilight. Never, she said, not for a single second. This life is more than I ever dreamed of. Grant pulled her in close with his free arm. I advertised for love, but I found my life. I found you. And I found my home. You and Grace are my home, she whispered. They had built a family from only hope. The mountains stood there as silent witnesses. In that house, their family was complete and deeply loved. 2 years on, Lydia gave birth to a son. They named him Daniel. This time the labor was easier, and Grant was a steady, calm presence. Little Grace was absolutely enchanted by her new baby brother. She wanted to help with everything, from changing diapers to giving him a bath. Lydia's heart was full watching her two children together. We're a family, Grace would proudly tell anyone who'd listen. That's right, darling, Lydia would say, smoothing her hair. We sure are. Well, the ranch did well, and they slowly bought more land, growing their herd. They hired some help, but Grant made sure the ranch never got too big. He told Lydia, I will not be the kind of father mine was, always lost in his work. And he kept his word. He taught a 4-year-old Grace how to ride a horse. He carved little toys for Daniel and read stories to them both every single night. On cold winter evenings, they'd gather right there by the fire. It was a simple, ordinary life, and it was absolutely perfect. One night, 5-year-old Grace looked up from her schoolwork. Mama, tell us the story of how you and Papa met. You promised. Lydia looked over at Grant, who just smiled and gave a little nod. All right, Lydia began. Once upon a time, there was a girl who was very sad. She lived in a big city, and she did not think she would ever find happiness. Why was she so sad, Mama? Grace asked with wide eyes. Because she was all alone and living with someone who was not kind to her at all. Then one day she saw an ad from a man looking for a wife. That was Papa, Grace guessed. That's right. He wrote that he wanted someone with a heart that wished to be loved. Grant continued the story. And when that brave girl wrote to me, I was so happy. I was just a lonely man back then, living in this big old house all by myself. So what happened next? Asked little Daniel, trying to keep up. Well, the girl got on a train for 4 whole days to come meet the man, Lydia said. She was mighty scared, not knowing if he would be a good man or a mean one. But Papa's not mean, Grace said, sure as anything. No, he is not. When your mama met your papa, she saw he was good and kind, so they got married. Grant smiled at Lydia. Well, not right away, he admitted. At first, we were both a little cautious around each other. But slowly, Lydia said, we started to see the good in each other. Your papa was so kind and strong. I just wanted to make him happy. Then a big storm hit. Grant's voice grew serious. The worst I'd ever seen. I got hurt outside with the animals, and your mama came looking for me. Were you scared? Grace asked. I was terrified, Lydia admitted, but I was more afraid of losing your papa, so I found him and brought him home. Grant pulled her close. Your mama saved my life. That's when we both knew. We knew what we had was real love. And then you had me, Grace declared. Lydia laughed. That came a little later, honey. But yes, then we had our family. And we'll always be together, right? Grace asked softly. Always, Grant promised. Your mama and I love you and Daniel more than anything in the world. We're a family and families always stick together. As the children went back to playing, Lydia leaned against Grant's shoulder. That's not exactly how I remember it, he whispered in her ear. You left out the part where I fell for you so hard I couldn't think straight. And how I thanked the good Lord every single day that you answered my letter. I left those parts out because they're just for us, Lydia whispered back. Grant kissed her temple. I love you, Lydia Mercer. Today and every day after. I love you too. You kept every one of your promises. You promised me a home, respect, and more kindness than I ever knew existed. She looked right at him. But most of all, you promised me a chance at happiness. And you gave me so much more. You gave me a purpose, a family. You gave me everything. You are everything I hoped for, Grant said softly. More than I deserve. You're wrong about that part, Lydia always replied. You deserve all the happiness in the world, and I plan to spend my life making sure you have it. The fire crackled in the hearth as snow fell gently outside. Grace worked on her letters while Daniel hummed, content with his blocks. And Grant and Lydia sat together watching their children and the life they had built from a simple promise. That one little ad changed her life. She became a cherished wife and mother, and Grant was no longer a haunted man. He was a husband and father with a purpose. You see, they had truly saved each other. They saved one another from a deep loneliness. Together, they built a real life, not a fairy tale, a life with its own share of joys and troubles. Their love grew from a risk born of desperation. It grew strong enough to weather any storm. With their children laughing nearby, Grant and Lydia knew they had finally found home. Theirs was a love worth every single risk, a love that was meant to last for generations. It became more than they had ever dreamed. This was family. This was true love, theirs forever.